All right, we'll be actually live in a couple of seconds. And we are live. All right. Welcome, everyone, to QuaranCon 2021. This is the Mental Health in SFF panel. And I'm really excited for this panel. While it's some very serious subject matter, I do hope that it'll be a fairly entertaining conversation nonetheless. I mean, because it's a serious subject matter, but also because I think the people we've got here to discuss it are, entertaining people. So I think we'll have we'll make a good discussion out of what's a fairly serious subject. So we're going to start off. Well, actually, wait, I have QuaranCon business to say. Just to remind everyone that if you are looking for more information about panels, go to QuaranCon2021.com. We actually own both domains, 2020 and 2021. So QuaranCon2020 or 2021.com /2021 schedule for this year's schedule specifically, but also just, go to the general website and click on schedule. There's also merch. Ew. And a bunch of other ways to be involved with the convention. And I'll mention all that again at the end. Hopefully we've got some people showing up. Please say hi in the live chat and put your questions there, and we will try to work in questions as we go, or maybe do them all at the end if conversation's lively enough. And so that's our starter, and we're going to start introductions with the gentleman directly below me. Go ahead, Rob.
Hi there, I'm Rob J. Hayes, author of many books at this point. What else am I supposed to do? How am I introducing myself?
Well, anything you like. What like, why is mental health in SFF important to you? Briefly. Okay. I mean, because obviously that's the whole panel, but
I mean, it's true. Okay, well, it's important to me. I personally suffer through bouts of depression, which can be quite debilitating at times, to the point of, sort of collapsed on the sofa, not really able to speak to anyone, just like switch off completely. So, and I think it's more common than a lot of people realize, not just in sort of like authors and everything, but in general in life. So I feel that getting that sort of representation in the books that we read, if we read fantasy, is important. So that's why it's important to me.
All right. Next, we're going to go the order I said before, but Sarah.
Okay. I heard the order, but it kind of like
I would have forgotten that too. Yeah, no, go ahead, Sarah.
So I'm Sara. I've written a few books. I've written a lot of books, but only a few are published. The Evan Star Chronicles is YA urban fantasy, and I have another one coming out, Arthur Claimed. So why mental illness rep in SFF is important to me. How am I doing blank? Well, I think it's important to like have science fiction fantasy show things that are real issues and not just like ignore things or act like, oh, this doesn't exist in the future or something. And also, like, I feel like it's especially important in YA because when I was in high school, I had a lot of issues with depression, and I was like in complete denial of it. I had all these misconceptions in my head about what it was, about treatments and everything, and refused to get help. And I feel like seeing like my favorite like science fiction or fantasy characters going through similar things would have actually made a huge difference when I was younger. So I think that's one of the reasons that sometimes I find it particularly important in books for teens too.
Awesome. That's a really solid point. Rachel, next.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I have one book out right now that's called Aspen Warrior, that's about tackling issues of identity in a fantasy setting. And it was really driven by the fact that I've read not enough, but a few books out in the past that they helped me go through my own issues when I was growing up. I've gone through issues of depressions, suicide, and it's been quite a roller coaster. And knowing that there were stories out there with characters who, if they didn't get how I was feeling, they at least showed me how to think about something in a different way, and that really meant everything to me. So I write books that they tackle these tough questions, because I need to help other people as I was helped by the authors who helped me.
Excellent. Next up, Sasha.
Hi, I'm Sasha. I write romance. I started off publishing contemporary romance, but now I write magical realism. So yeah, I think I would echo a lot of what Sara said. I think, you know, it affects everyone really. Like, even if you're not having problems with mental health, and you'll know someone who does, and that affects, you know, because of the friendship and knock-on effects, and you know, so I think it affects everyone to some extent. And I do think, yeah, about the representation, you know, the fact that it's normal, it's over the past few years it's become quite normalized, more normalized, you know, but it's been a long uphill struggle. And I think, yeah, that's why it's so important, so that people see themselves in books.
Totally. And Clayton.
I'm Clayton. I've written a slew of novels. My two most recent probably deal more with mental health than anything else. As far as why I think mental health matters in SFF, as everyone else has kind of mentioned here, representation is important. Being able to normalize that sort of thing, and making sure that people get the help they need, but also kind of kicking back against the negative depictions that media is really fond of. I think both those things kind of go hand in hand. So
Solid, yeah. And I think we're going to get into pretty much every point that folks have brought up as we've gone through. I will finish up with my introduction. I am Virginia McClain, and also an author. I've got 2 different series going, whatever, I would say the same thing. There's some books, but both of my series deal with mental health in various ways. I personally suffer from depression, off and on anxiety, and grief has been a big thing for me lately. I lost both my parents on the same day last year. Yeah. So grief is a thing that has been much more at the forefront of my experiences lately. And of course, it plays into the other issues that I have been dealing with anyway. And also ADHD, which can either exacerbate some of the existing problems, or is perhaps, I don't know, there's comorbidity between ADHD and anxiety and depression, I know for sure. And then of course, grief just, I feel like, magnifies anything that that someone has going on. So anyway, so a lot of my writing reflects those experiences, and I also believe that representation is important for everything, and for me in particular for mental health issues. It's a big deal. I've always gravitated towards characters that struggle with not just mental health issues, but even the morality of being a hero, and I feel like that ties into it a lot too, because we often see heroes that are never traumatized by their actions as a hero, right? They blithely kill a bunch of bad guys and then move on with their day, and when I read that, I'm like, what is wrong with you? Like, not in a mental health sort of way, but like the absence of, like, how have you distanced yourself from all that violence 5 seconds later? Anyway, that's something that we may get into later. But for me, that's how I sort of started on that path, was sort of wanting to write a hero that didn't do that had issues with the violence that they were required to commit in order to fight for what they considered to be the right thing. And then it sort of snowballed from there. So let's get into all of the deeper issues that we've started with. And mental health rep, I think pretty much everyone mentioned that was something that was important to them. Let's talk about mental health rep in SFF. There's definitely some bad, but let's start with the good. Sort of on the start with an up note, go down and then back up again. I don't know, but what good mental health rep have you noticed, or should we start with the bad? I don't know. What do you guys think? What do y'all think?
I would say I think it's something that science fiction and fantasy has possibly been better at than historically than other types of fiction. So like, I think about sort of back when I was reading as a teenager, Tamora Pierce and Mercedes Lackey and stuff, and they did go into, the effects of bullying, how bad it can be and how damaging it can be, and, all that kind of stuff. I don't think they had quite the sort of mental health language that we would use today, but, it was clear that sort of actions like that had effects and explored, those kind of effects. So I think historically it's got a much longer history than a lot of other fiction.
That's a fair point. So let's stick with the good then. So we've started on a good swing. What's some other good things about mental health rep in SFF? What examples have you seen that you liked, that you want to see more of, that are done well?
One recent one I thought was done well was in the Sound of Our Stars.
Mm-hmm.
And that, as I thought, had a fairly good depiction of anxiety and how, like, I don't know, it felt realistic to me, and also like the character had some help, like, I don't know, good ways to cope with it, I guess, and to work through it, even though they were in kind of an extreme situation with like alien invasions and I don't know, but despite the I don't know, like the situation, like I thought it was handled really well, and I don't think it fell into the issue of like, the heroes killing a bunch of bad guys and not having any like reaction to it too. Like I felt like well, there wasn't, the main character didn't really go around killing anyone, so it wasn't like that kind of violence, but I felt like her anxiety and the way she interacted with everything that was happening to her in the world seemed like it was well done, and not like, didn't really ignore, the more traumatic things.
That makes sense. So I haven't actually read it, so I can't unfortunately provide any like intelligent commentary where but it sounds like that was helpful.
Yeah.
People have other
it was good rep.
I think a very popular one that I've sort of noticed recently is probably going to be one that everybody's going to agree with or not. Is the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. I mean, the whole thing about the characters in that is the superpowers they essentially have come from, creatures, spirits that bond with them when they are broken due to these mental health issues. I mean, the main character, Kaladin, deals very heavily with depression. And personally, that's something that I identified with, because many of the sort of like the symptoms of it that he experiences, I feel there, and so I'm sort of reading along or actually listening along and going, yeah, I completely like get where that guy's coming from. I've been through that, and it's not just like that character. Like all of the sort of main characters have something that has broken them in the past that they're trying to recover from. And I think that's one of the main things. They're trying to recover from it as well. They're trying to not let it rule them. They're trying to continue living and being good people, basically.
Gotcha. That does sound like good. I hate to admit, I haven't actually read the Stormlight Archives. I don't actually hate to admit it, but I'm almost mildly embarrassed because it feels like that's a thing that everyone has read, but I have not.
I have not read it either. So
that was going to be my
that was going to be your example.
Yeah, like
there's so many books out there, you can't read them all.
It's true, you can't. Does anyone else have other examples they'd like to give? I can think of one, but I'll throw one in while Rachel, while you're thinking of a different one, because Rob stole yours. So I actually, Harrow the Ninth, and I don't know how much I can talk about it without spoilers, but there's definitely some representation of trauma and its after effects in that book. And I found it to be very compelling and interesting. And it also deals with things that, some things that I have dealt with, some things that I haven't, right? Grief is definitely a part of that. I think I can say that without it being too much of a spoiler, because I could be talking about anyone. So you don't have to know which characters. But yeah, it's a very interesting take on some very serious mental health issues that I enjoyed reading recently. And smaller ones too. I mean, I'm trying to think. There's so many good examples. Oh, actually, so Lisa Cassidy's A Tale of Stars and Shadow is probably, it's one of my favorite reads of the past couple of years, the whole series, all 4 books. And it's all about like the main character is just going through this all the, not all the bits, because there's no, I don't think processing grief cannot be doesn't follow a map, but that character she's definitely on a journey through her own grief and still pushing through, and also dealing with depression, strongly tied to that, but potentially, existing on its own as well. Anyway, I thought that was a really great example. Okay, so now does anyone else? I gave time to think. No, nothing.
Yeah.
Clayton. Yeah.
Sorry. Michelle Baker. It's been a while since I've read it, but Michelle Baker's Borderline is actually about borderline personality disorder, which I've been diagnosed with, and it's interesting because as a illness, it's very difficult to describe. It's this kind of chaotic swirl of emotion and compulsion and everything else just kind of rolled into itself. And that book really takes the aspects of the illness and turns them into positives for the main character. The way she communicates with the other world, the way she can slip between worlds, and there's still that sort of internal struggle, but it's kind of parceled out in a way that is positive representation that people with BPD aren't all knife wielding maniacs, which is always nice to see.
Yeah.
So
that is one it would be really nice to get away from, as far as the very harmful stereotypes that media has perpetrated.
I've got to admit, that's most of what I've seen of borderline personality disorder on like TV shows and the like, is usually that somebody has BPD and there's at some point they are going to snap and cause violence. That's kind of their character arc on TV shows, isn't it, really? So
yeah, and it's really baffling because any violence that's done by either myself or people that know BPD is mentally and internal. It's not an external thing.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I'm not the only person I know with that, and the other person I know also is like actually spends a lot of his time doing advocacy work, dispelling that particular harmful. I don't even want to call it a stereotype, because it's not even. It's just a sort of just a lie that's just been perpetuated by the media, right? Like, it's not like they took something that was actually true and pushed it. They just like made stuff up.
Yeah, it's a lazy trope. It's just things sound scary, so let's make it. Right. It's yeah.
Yeah. What I find interesting about BPD in particular is, if you read the work of Dr. Jessica Taylor, for example, she says that a lot of people that have or get diagnosed as having BPD is actually a perfectly normal trauma response. So they've had something traumatic happen in their lives, and so this sort of ties in with sort of naming of things, names for things, and putting people in boxes, which is something I really hate. It's like, so you get labeled with a disorder, which is helpful for some people because at least they know it's not all in their head, but then there's a lot of things sort of in that you put someone in a certain box, and then you say, well, this person's going to act in a certain way because they have this particular condition, which can be problematic as well.
For sure. I mean, it's interesting. I think if we talk about the collective issues that we've all stated as being things we identify with, I think you could probably look up most of those. And if you were going to find harmful stereotypes, you'd probably see most people would be like, wait, these people dealing with these issues are all successful authors, like, because that's not normally something that goes in the box next to each of the various issues we've discussed, and yet, hi everyone, here's 6 of us, and with varying issues that we deal with constantly, and yet And I'd let you know, and of course I don't just putting us in a box of successful authors is also weird, not saying that but people are complicated, and they can accomplish things and also fail at things and whatever. Like, I can struggle to remember to eat in a day, but I can still write books, and like I don't know how to explain how those two things are possible, but they are, and so yeah, like those labels can be helpful in certainly in getting people to enabling people to find help for their issues, and in helping them identify potential resources and just like there's a lot that can be done with identifying with something too, right? Like personally, like when I finally realized I had ADHD as an adult, a lot of things fell into place in my head that previously I was just like, I don't know why I'm so broken. I just am. And now I feel like I have a much better idea of where certain things that I do come from. And that's helpful to me. But, someone looking at me and saying, you have ADHD and therefore you can't do this would not be helpful, right? Anyway, so
I think they can also be, but the representation can also be quite helpful for people to realize what's going on with them. If they don't, I know for one, I didn't realize that I was getting depressed. Basically, I used to just sort of, I used to call it melancholia, which is like an oldie termy like phrase for it. But like I remember when I met my lass, I actually said at one point, I was like, I go through phases of melancholia where I struggle to sort of communicate, and so if I go really silent, it might just be because I'm feeling a bit melancholic, but I had no idea at the time that it was just like, yeah, actually I go through periods of depression where it really sort of strikes me down, and that's what's happening. And I don't think it was until, I think it was memes actually, I think I came across a bunch of memes which were sort of describing depression, and I was like, oh shit, that's what happens. That's me. So, and I think in books, it can do the same sort of thing. If you read somebody going through the same thing you're going through, even if you don't know that that's what you're going through, suddenly you're like, oh yeah.
Totally, that callback. And I think the internet is surprisingly useful for that. Like, for all the problems that Twitter has, I would not have wound up with an adult ADHD diagnosis were I not seeing a bunch of ADHD memes and following a fellow author who was talking about her own struggles with adult ADHD and a diagnosis. And it was literally just watching her talk about how her brain worked, and then about her getting her diagnosis. And I was reading her descriptions and I was like, that is me. That's what she's describing, is what goes on inside my head. And I seriously, even though I had a childhood diagnosis, I wouldn't have known that was still it, because we just, like, my family ignored it and I assumed it wasn't true, and then was having all these issues anyway. But yeah, it's really helpful to see that somewhere and feel it just sort of reflected back at you, even if you don't have the right terms for it. And sometimes the internet's good for that, but also so are books. And so I think that's a really great point as to why that mental health rep is good. Should we anyone want to do a few more good examples before we move on? Well, we've thrown in a few bad examples too. We can go either way. Just speak up, and if you've got a good example or a bad example, just
I think what I would like to see more of, I think the books we've talked about that deal with, there are books that specifically take issues and explore issues in various different ways. But I think what I don't see enough, or as much as I'd like, is people who have these issues, but it's not a major plot point in the book. So you might have someone who's struggling with a mental health condition, but it's an integral part of their character, but it's not an integral part of the plot. So, it's like, it's no more important than their relationship with their parents, or, their awful job, or, it's a big part of their lives, but it's not the actual what happens in the book and how do they get to the end. I don't feel, it's hard to make, I'm always a bit wary of making general comments about a genre because there's so many books out there, and it could be I just haven't discovered them yet, but I haven't discovered those kind of, I think that's true representation. I sort of wonder if you have to go through the exploration of issues to get to the true representation. But I also feel like both types of books are very important, ones that explore it, and then also ones that just sort of treat it as if it's a normal part of everyday life, and of course it's just there.
That's a, I mean, that's a, yeah, great point. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say, I feel like that's like a recent, like very recent YA science fiction fantasy. I feel like that has happened in like the example that I brought up before with the anxiety representation. Like the book was not about anxiety representation. The book was about like, you know, this person dealing with like Earth after it's been invaded by aliens, but you know, it was a part of their character, and yes, it came up, like there were times where they had panic attacks and had to use like coping mechanisms to get through them, but it was not like the plot point of the book. And then one person in the YouTube chat had mentioned, I always get the title of this wrong, but A Song of Race and Ruin, and that was another one where the character had anxiety, and the story was not about the anxiety. It did have a connection to it, but it was not a book about anxiety. The character just happened to have anxiety and, you know, had to work through things related to the anxiety, you know, in the plot, but it wasn't like the plot. It was just, you know, it was probably equal to, yeah, I mean, the character's relationship with her mother was part of, you know, probably like an equal, like it was, those type of things were kind of on par. They were tied into the story, but they were not like the whole, you know, the rest of the plot was the main focus.
Actually, if we can bring up like, well, so for example, Rob's series with the War Eternal. Now, granted, I haven't read books 2 and 3 yet. Oh, poster behind. But the main character, at least in book 1, it's very clear that Eska is dealing with some of these issues, and yet they are not plot points also. I don't know if they become plot points later on, so I can't speak to that. But Rob, do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, they do and they don't. They're sort of they become minor plot points throughout, but the story, it's never about her dealing with anxiety and depression. She quite clearly does. I mean, slight spoiler, she basically gets a demon, which is a metaphor for her anxiety. It literally sits in her head and tells her that she's worthless at times and stuff like that. It's not fun. But
very direct metaphor.
Yeah, at times.
But
Sometimes
well done. No, yeah.
Sometimes it is. But that's a lot of that is that little demon that's the metaphor for anxiety is her learning to communicate with it and to live with it, basically. So that is a plot point throughout the series. But it's the series itself is never about that. There is, you know, sort of like a much more traditional epic fantasy sort of like plot going on with bad guys to defeat and gods to challenge and all that lot. But at the same time, there is this idea that she very clearly has some serious issues with anxiety and depression and even suicidal thoughts and stuff like that. And it's her dealing with that. It's touched on multiple times.
Okay, cool. And so now we get into the fact that I haven't actually read everyone else's works, but I would love for you all to talk about the ways in which your works further things like that. Like, do you have rep that is rep for rep's sake, and it's not a plot point? You've just got characters that have the thing and deal with the thing, but meanwhile they're fighting monsters instead of internal monsters or whatever. Or overthrowing governments, or, you know, anyone, please. I don't know who to pick on exactly, because I don't want you to be like, no, I don't have that, and then feel bad.
I have the two most recent, as I had mentioned, the novel I wrote with Michael Fletcher. The character I took on in that book actually suffers from anxiety and PTSD and depression. And part of his theme is if you take those things away without correcting the core flaw, what does that make a person? So it's kind of, he's not so much fixed as, and I don't know, I don't think that's the correct term, but he hasn't so much dealt with them as he's buried them, and it's really unhealthy for him. The other novel is Demons Inc., and that's, I don't know that falls necessarily under sort of umbrella that you're looking for here, but basically what I wanted to write was about having BPD. So the main character in that has demons that he's bound to himself, and each of them is an aspect of his mental illness, and he uses those to his benefit.
Okay.
As he goes through the story, they actually help him out, while they also they're a double-edged sword for him.
That seems like a pretty legit metaphor. Sorry, I'm not trying to make light of that. I just have a terrible humor. I'm not,
You're fine.
okay. Okay, so Clayton's got some examples there. But Sasha, Rachel, Sarah, any other examples?
I guess I do it in a bit of a different way, really, when I'm exploring. So like the book I'm currently working on, it's called Sakaara Nights, and it was driven out of, I lost both my grandfathers within the space of a month, and it was, I was really like very close to them. And after I lost them, I felt almost guilty. I felt very guilty. I was left with this question of, living for myself versus, actually sustaining the legacy of them, and doing things that they would have wanted. And this completely changed. I was trapped in this, having this conversation with myself for years, and I wrote the book to try and explore this issue. And the way I tackle the issue of the grief is not by having a character necessarily feeling grief, but by creating a setting where everything is that question of legacy, living for yourself versus living for others. I push it to the extreme. That's why I was finding Sasha's point earlier about, do we need both of like subtle representation versus in your face? And I'm definitely, I do that with the stories I write. It's that I want to just explore the point as intensely as I can, through all sorts of ways, whether that's the magic system or it's the setting, or but I think representation of the characters as well, I think that's something that I hope we're all getting better at doing, that more and more authors will do that as time progresses.
That's solid. And I like the idea of sort of playing to both those things. You've got explicit in your face rep and a subtle exploration of the ideas at the same time. It's very cool. Sasha, Sarah? Yeah. Sarah?
How I handle it's like been evolving a little bit as I write, which almost kind of maybe was something Sasha had said earlier, kind of made me think of it. And like in my earlier books, like Power Surge, in the novella Life Minus Me, like it was, while the books weren't exactly about those things, like there are still, especially in Power Surge, like there's still a demon hunting plot, but the characters' anxiety and depression and ADHD too were like really central to the story. And it was all kind of like, those things were things I've dealt with. They're all kind of new, like they were necessarily new to me, but my understanding that I had them was new. So they really were prominent in the story, but I noticed in my later works, as I get more comfortable with things myself, they're still there in a way, but they're not nearly as integral to the plot as they had been in Power Surge. Like I've written a middle grade book, which hasn't been published yet. I'm querying it to literary agents right now, Junk Junction, and the character does have some anxiety, not really depression, but there's definitely some anxiety, and it's kind of a comorbidity with their ADHD and some sensory issues, but it's there, but it's not really connected to the plot at all. And the character has a little bit of growth with it, but it's really just like, hey, there's this, other character has to go into this grocery store at this point, and it's a really minor plot point, and then you see the anxiety comes up. But for the most part, it's like really just subtle. It's there, but it's not part of it. Where in my earlier books, it was like, again, it wasn't a book about those things, but they had a really strong connection to the plot and were really more prominent. So maybe as I get more comfortable with these things myself and I have a better understanding of them, I feel like I'm still putting the representation in my books, but I'm making the books less about those things and having them just be more like, hey, this character happens to, have this thing.
Yeah.
and have it be much less tied to the plot than in my earlier stories.
That does seem like a progression that might happen naturally. I mean, like I think both things are good, so it's not like it would necessarily, but yeah, that you would. I personally I've done something similar, which is why I'm saying that. Like I've made mental health more of a plot related issue in earlier books, and now it's become like my latest book that's coming out in May is very much, it's just these people have various issues, and I know that as I'm writing them as they're part of their characters, but it does not come into the actual plot, except for it affects the way they deal with things, but it's not actually tied to any particular plot point. And often for them, it's not a question of character growth, like overcoming that, except in just like the day-to-day of it, not like as an overarching thing that they must get over. But Sasha, didn't hear from you at all. I don't know.
I think I would say the same thing about my writing, but I wonder if, when I first started writing, I wanted to write about mental health because no one was writing about it, not in a sort of explicit way, not that I could find, and I mean, going back quite a few years now, but I think, my first couple of books that I wrote, the first one was about suicide, and the second one, was about PTSD, the effects of that. I mean, one of the good things about writing romance is that, your main plot arc is the romance between two people. So you always have that, so there can be other things going on. And of course, each character has their own arc. But then now I sort of feel like there's much more people writing about it. So, I feel like it's less of a crusade, and, I can go away and write more what I really want to write, which, at the moment, I mean, it changes from book to book, but, at the moment, it's kind of like just representation. I think it will always be there in some way. I mean, the book I'm writing at the moment is about a woman who can see when people are ill.
Oh, interesting.
So, of course, that brings up lots of questions like, of course, do you tell them? Do you not tell them? So she has to go through all this kind of mental kind of, then once you've told them, how do you deal with their grief and, all this kind of stuff. And so that I think it's always going to be present in my books to a certain extent, because I think, they're very interesting topics. But I think, I find myself like you and Sarah have said, it's becoming less obvious, less sort of in your face, and much more subtle. But that may just be as my writing improves as well.
I mean, I don't know if I hate to equate it to that, because I do think there's an important role for both of those versions, right? So I wouldn't want it to say, oh, it's because of, like personally, I wouldn't want it to say like it's because I'm getting better as a writer, I'm now making it more subtle. I feel like, but I do feel like it's a similar thing of like feeling like you've dealt with it if you've addressed it directly in a couple of books where it has been more of an issue. Like I wrote 2 books where the character, it basically winds up with PTSD after fighting a bunch of people to in a rebellion to overthrow a corrupt government, right? And then that messes her up, and that was a very explicit address of that issue. And now I'm writing characters who have dealt with similar things or are dealing with similar things, but it's just in the background. It's a thing that they're dealing with, and it's part of their day to day, and it's less a like this is an in your face plot point.
Yeah, and like I said, I think you do need both types of books because I think also, I'm very interested in this sort of balance between, I mean, in a way, fiction books are supposed to be escapist, right? In some respects. I mean, maybe even more for science fiction and fantasy, I don't know. But so if I'm reading really heavy sort of books about, people going through really traumatic stuff, although, I mean, that's really important. That's really interesting to read because, like exploring these kind of ideas is really fascinating. But if I'm reading that kind of really heavy stuff all the time, sometimes I do just want a book where people go out and do stuff and slay people and don't really bother and it's fine. And so yeah, it's I think you do need both types of books.
Yeah, I think that is ultimately. I mean, that's how I feel about it anyway. I love that both those things exist. I want there to be really heady books about the problems that humans face with inside our own heads and the various ways those manifest. And I also want there to be books where, these people have problems that turn out to be pretty common, or even if they're not that common, but they're things that we should acknowledge. But they're also just day to day, and yay, raw, in self-insert adventure fantasy, go. You know, and because I think, like, it's nice to see just people succeeding and but I also love the idea of taking like a really tough problem and having that be, like in Clayton's example, where it's the double-edged sword of like, these demons are helpful and I'm literally succeeding at this quest because of them, and also they're slicing me up a bit. That's cool. That's really cool. And I feel like people who deal with these issues like will enjoy reading that, right? And appreciate the complexity of it, because it's complex, there's nuance, and we need all these things, is how I feel about it. I'm getting a little shouty about it, but
once you've explored the issue deeply within yourself, you then add it to your substrate for like the next world you build. So it's there then that you can sort of dig into that a character can experience. But I mean, that's how a lot of authors do work, by exploring things inside themselves within the page, within the books that they're writing.
Which brings us, thank you, Rob, very much, very nicely into yet another question, which is writing as a processing tool for your own issues. So this was a thing I mentioned in the email I sent out. How much, so I'm actually going to read out of my notes because my brain is melting. So writing is a processing tool for your own trauma and experiences. How much do you use your fiction as a processing tool for your own issues? And do you tend to use a direct approach? I went through blank, so my characters did too, or do you use metaphors and adjacent experiences instead? I feel like Rachel probably already exactly answered this question, but it put it to all of us. And Rachel, feel free to talk more about it. You're not like cut off or anything. But how? Yeah, let's talk more about that. You've lived through some shit. How deeply does your writing help you process it, and how directly do you put it into the work, if at all? Go.
It really varies. It really varies. The works that mental illness was a more prominent theme in were definitely works where I put maybe a little bit too much of myself into it. And then when a reviewer on Goodreads was like, I really don't like how angry and edgy this character sounds, and I'm like, and that's kind of based off of this like weird internal narrative that's in my head. Great, thank you.
You're like, I can no longer distance myself from the work. You just insulted me.
My mental voice in my head comes across a lot differently than how I come across. It's very inconsistent, especially if I'm in a depressive episode versus being hypomanic. And so I don't know. So this character's voice was really a lot based off of my anxiety and the depressed side of my brain. The character was not me. We had a lot of different experiences and not exactly the same diagnosis maybe, but there's a little bit too much maybe. So I learned a lesson there. Either that, or if I do it again, not to read the reviews.
That may be the key, actually.
Just not to read the reviews. Yeah. But then there was a book where I tried to not write, I tried to write a neurotypical character that had no mental illness, and I went back after a few years and I read it and I was like, yeah, no, this character is not what I'm seeing these all these anxiety signals in this character, and I'm and ADHD cute things, and I'm like, yeah, no, I did not write the character I set out to write. And so when I was going back and revising, I just let the character be who they wanted to be, and brought out some of the anxiety a little bit more, and made the character a tiny bit more aware of it, and maybe coded them as ADHD a little bit more. In this book, it's not part of the plot really. It's the plot is something completely unrelated, but I just made it a little bit, I don't know, so people might recognize it in the character as opposed to
sprinkled it on. Yeah
but it's totally unrelated to the plot, but it's there.
It's there. I don't think I'd know how to go about writing a neurotypical character.
Yeah, I don't think I tried.
Outside of copying a character off the page from somebody else. But even then I wouldn't be sure of it, because how do you even know? I feel like a lot of authors also, you read their characters, and we who have issues are like, oh yeah, that character's totally coded as ADHD or as, having anxiety or depression. And if you ask that author, they'd be like, oh no, that person's totally fine. And you're like, okay. do we have some issues that we need to address? But anyway, sorry, that's a separate piece. But anyway, I wouldn't know how to go about it. But let's go back to the question at hand. Sorry. Hi, Jack.
I had a very interesting experience because I actually started doing research into mental health before I had any mental health problems, or like looking back on maybe earlier in my life, I can tell now I have more experience, but like serious mental health problems. I actually started off writing romance. I was like, I took like the typical trope, you have this hunky ex-soldier who has PTSD, and then I was like, well, if I'm going to do this right, I have to do research. So I started reading into it, and I was like, oh, why is nobody writing about this stuff? Because it's really important, and because I knew very little about mental health, and hadn't really sort of come across it wasn't really in my vocabulary. And then a few years after I started writing and doing all this research, I went through, I had a bad reaction to some anti-malarial drugs and went through quite a bad patch of mental health. But it was really helpful, having done all this research, to then go, oh, this is perfectly normal. This is where you go to get help. Because I'd done all this research into, what would your characters do if they were in these kind of situations, and how would they cope? And so I had all these resources, and I think in some ways it made me even more passionate about representation, because I was like, well, if you give people these tools, then they know that it's normal, and they know where they can get help, and they know, this kind of stuff. And I think, so yeah, I had the sort of backwards kind of experience, which is maybe quite different from a lot of other people.
That's an interesting twist on it, if only because it sounds like also in doing that research, you also took away the stigma that a lot of people feel around it, which I think is a big piece, because I certainly know plenty of people who know the resources and stuff for various reasons, either because someone else that they know has gone through something similar, or because they're actually a psychologist themselves, or but when it comes time for to recognize their own issues with anxiety, depression, or what have you, the stigma is strong enough that, oh no, it's not me, that's not how my brain works, that they still don't actually know to do any of that, right? So I love that when it came to you, you'd done all this research and you're like, okay, well, this is normal, and now I'm going to look this up and I'm going to go talk to this person. Like, that's great. And that's ultimately what helped.
Yeah, it helped a lot. I was stuck for sort of like years and years, like you said, wondering what the hell's going on.
But it doesn't always work out that way. So it's really nice when it does. So yay. Clayton, and I was gonna say, Rachel, I mean, Rachel, you already did talk about it once. You don't have to talk about it again, or you can. And Clayton, we haven't heard from you yet.
I guess with Demons was very, very personal. A lot of what I went through and a lot of what I go through is on the page. The whole time there's a voice in the back of my head when I'm writing it telling me, don't talk about this. And of course I had to ignore that, because it's that someone had told me a while back that if you're going to write about these things, you need to be honest with yourself and honest with your audience. And so I had to ignore that little screaming voice in the back of my head that said, people are going to look at you weird, but they already do. So it's
any consolation, they look at me weird too.
Right.
So. That's a neat and interesting way. Like I'm trying, I think to some degree, we all have a little voice when we get to something that's really personal that says, don't put this on the page. This is too close to home. You can't do that. You're leaving yourself open on the page. But it sounds like it is literally a stronger voice that we're talking about. And in your case, and I'm very curious about that. Like, it sounds like it's got to take a lot of focus and resilience to write that, and even with that voice screaming at you.
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely a couple of moments when I would stop and just wipe out entire pages, and then I'd go back and rewrite the whole thing, and because I knew what I was doing was, again, something I had to be honest about if I was going to write about the whole experience versus just little bits and pieces and give people only the pretty parts of it. That was important to me. So
that's really. I'm trying to think of adjectives that are appropriate. Like I respect the hell out of that is what I'm really trying to say. I think, every other adjective I come up with makes it sound fluffy. I respect the hell out of that. That's awesome.
It's fascinating hearing Clayton talk about having it, because it's a self-preservation voice in your head, isn't it? And I don't have it, which it's really interesting to hear you talk about it, because I'm a bit reckless, shall we say, with how much of myself I'm willing to put on the page. And it's only after a book is out and I see the reviews coming through, I go, oh, okay, that was way too much of yourself. People are like, it's like you're reading a diary entry reading this person's book. I'm like, yep, oops. Too far, bring it into the next one, but then I always forget. But I think something that it was interesting hearing Sara say that they didn't like to read reviews and of the books that they've written, because I actually find that it's quite terrifying the first few reviews that you read. But then one thing I've noticed since then is that I found a way of connecting with other people out there who have gone through similar things that I've gone through because of the books I've written. I'm almost finding a community out there, which is, as terrifying it is putting so much of myself onto the page. I'm getting rewarded with that by being able to, connect with people about issues that I was just dealing with alone, which was never something I imagined when I first started putting my experiences down on page in that way.
That's really neat, actually. It's always nice to stumble into community, right? And it's really great that you've found people with similar experiences. We do have, let's see, we've got 8 minutes left, and we do have some audience questions. So if people are feeling all right with it, I'm gonna take a look at those and relay some. Does that sound good? Okay.
Yeah.
No one is shouting no at me, so I'm gonna go ahead and go for it. I usually like enthusiastic consent, but everyone's looking a bit subdued. So.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah! Charge!
Great.
Okay, great. Excellent. All right. So does anyone happen to know of any SFF books with bipolar disorder rep? I have it and struggle to find good rep. That's from Lyra Bat, or they're two Y's. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it. Lyra. Anyway, bipolar rep. Anyone?
Not read any myself.
I can't. I have bipolar, but I can't remember ever seeing it in a book that I've read. And one day I want to write one, but I haven't gotten quite there yet. Right. But I would love to see, if anyone did know of any, I would love to read one. But
I haven't come across any either, so I'm sorry, Lyra. We cannot, apparently, we can't help you.
Obviously, someone needs to write one.
Clearly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Sara, since you just self-identified, I'm going to say it's up to you, because I know if I did it, it would not, it would not be coming from personal experience. So obviously you don't have to do that.
It's on my list of things eventually to write about, but it's something that I feel like is diagnosed more in adulthood than, and I've been writing more teens and kids.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not it exists, I think, in younger people, but it's more diagnosed later, I think, or in young adults. And so eventually, if I have an adult book planned, it's like a parent. I'm calling it haunted home improvement work in progress. And if I write that, whenever I get to writing it, I'm going to write adult character with bipolar. But I have to actually get beyond the first 5 pages of the book.
Okay. Okay, so Lyra, keep an eye out. Follow Sara on Twitter and check for that in a couple of years. I don't know. Whenever.
Yeah, who knows?
Whenever they get around to it.
I have so many things I'm working on right now. It's ridiculous.
Totally fair. Let's continue through the questions because we've got a few more. Kitvaria, just Julia Kitvaria Serena, I believe, says Eska is a perfectly fine, normal human being coughs must be, as I've rarely connected to a character that much before. Kitvaria, you may want to talk to Rob. That's all I'm going to say.
Yes, she's a perfectly well-adjusted human being.
who suffers from anxiety and depression. Yes, that's right.
Yes.
And let's see. Building on what Sasha said, do you often look back at your early characters and recognize neurodiverse elements that you didn't realize you'd created? Anyone else want to take that?
Well, I kind of, because the book Power Surge that I've talked about a few times is something that I actually tried to write when I was 18. And I didn't finish it. Like, it got published 10 years after I first tried to write it, or maybe it was even more than that, because I tried to write it like 3 times when I was in college. Like when I was 18, when I was 20, when I was 21, it never happened. And it was like, you know, almost a decade later when I went back, I'd written a different book, and I was finally actually like writing every day and not, because before, like, I would write for like a few weeks, then I wouldn't write again for like months. And when I finally like found a way to make it like a consistent thing and actually finish works instead of starting 20 books and never finishing any of them, I went back to that one, and I did notice things about like the character being depressed, having ADHD, now that like I was more aware of them myself, or just becoming aware of them, and then like made it more intentional when I actually finished the book. But and before that, and then like from there on is when I really started writing more. Like, so my earlier stuff, it would be interesting to go back and look at some of those things that I started and never finished. Like, a lot of them are in notebooks and stuff, and see like what's there that I didn't know about.
I think that's something I'd like to do as well. Like, I want to go back and read some stuff that I wrote long before I had a diagnosis and see just how many of my characters are coded as ADHD already, you know, like, because I always sprinkle in a little bit of myself into most of my POV characters. They're never me. They're never even really that close to me, but I always put a little bit in. And so I wonder how much of that, if reading back on it, I would be like, oh yeah, that's totally
that involves reading back through your old works, which
fair is risky business, risky proposition altogether. But does anyone else have experience with that, of finding stuff in your earlier work that you wouldn't have recognized at the time, but you'd recognize now as being part of those identities?
I have a character who, it's literally only just occurred to me. He's dealing with he lost a limb, and I have like severe chronic back pain and it's not going away. And I've just realized, like, I started writing that character about the same time as I started going through the pain, and I was with the character, like, he was dealing with this issue. This is like weird. I'm like, how did I not connect this before? But yeah, he was dealing with like the fact that his life was going to be very different now, and having this change of identity, and that was something I was working through at the time. Yeah, and now I'm worried about what else I've missed in the
but I mean, I think that's the beautiful thing about writing. And this is, I think it ties nicely into how we use it as a processing tool, is that sometimes it's not even an intentional processing tool. We sit down to tell a story and we think that the themes are one thing, and they, you know, probably we hit those too. And then we look back on it and we find that we've addressed additional themes, additional issues, additional identities. I think it's a really beautiful thing about fiction. Does anyone, let's see, I'm looking for more. Please keep, if anyone else has points on that, I'm looking for more questions. So go ahead.
When I was writing the War Eternal series with Vesca again, when I started writing book 2, I was going through some sort of like a bit of a weird time in my life where I was feeling very directionless, just sort of aimless and you know, not going anywhere. And a lot of that, in fact, pretty much all of that just came into the second book. So the first time I tried to write the second book, Eska just didn't do anything. The book didn't go anywhere. It coasted along, and it was boring and crap. And it wasn't until I think it was about a year later that I realized that that's what I had done. I had put everything that I was feeling into the book. and because of what I was feeling at the time was just this complete directionless. It turned out it was not a very good book. So it got scrapped and completely rewritten.
I mean, fair enough. There is, as much as positive rep is great, and we like to do that, there is a degree to which the worst parts of depression are really pretty boring.
It still has to be entertaining, doesn't it? I mean, funnily enough, that's something I found about the latest, the Stormlight Archives books. It's like, it was great to have this sort of representation of the character going through pretty extreme depression, but at times it was like, God, man, just snap out of it, please.
This is where you're like, yeah, I get this enough in my own life, bud. Could we move on?
Yeah. It gets a bit much.
So there you go, right? There's a balance to be hit. It is 6 o'clock, which is just about the time. It is the time we're supposed to wrap up. The next event starts in 15 minutes. I'm not running it for tech, so we can squidge by a couple minutes past. But that's kind of the majority of the questions. Oh, wait. Pam has asked a last minute, how do your characters' mental concerns manifest physically? And does this influence how you write their movement or mannerisms? Does anyone have an answer for that one? I could throw in a quick, I have a new character from my newest book, who I've given actually a couple characters in this book ADHD on purpose, which is the first time I'm ever intentionally giving my characters an issue that I have as well. And one of them is a very fidgety ADHD person, and she has, it's actually a hunko, it's a Japanese seal, but it's got a little blade inserted in it, and she's constantly flipping it through her fingers. And so basically any scene where she's supposed to be paying attention to something, she is, but she has to be doing this through her hands. And that's a very specific piece I put in, and that is a physical manifestation of ADHD. And I have another character that has ADHD, but is an entirely different type, and so she's not dealing with that physical fidget as much. But that was just my piece. If anyone else wants to answer that, we have just enough time for one more person or two more people maybe to talk about it briefly, and then I'm going to cut us off.
Well, I have a lot of characters that pace around a lot for ADHD and with the anxiety. I had one character that had issues with self-harming, so sometimes that would come up, like they'd be trying to stop themselves or even fidget so they're not trying to claw themselves. I don't know. But so it's in the fidgeting and the pacing and stuff definitely manifests in a lot of my characters.
That's cool. Anyone else?
Yeah, with Jack and demons, it's super subtle. When the rage demon manifests, he basically just he becomes denser. His skin becomes tougher. He's literally harder to kill because he is so angry. And but that's his demon coming to the fore. It's also harder for him to control his emotions, harder for him to realize what he's doing while he's doing it.
Interesting. It sounds like a bit of a berserker trope, sort of.
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah.
That's interesting. That's cool. Any others? I lied. Everybody can throw in if they want. But
I mean, I know it's not something I sort of consciously did, but I've had a few sort of characters in the past where they have intermittent pain that will flare up when certain things are happening. Like a book that I'm working on at the moment called Guns to the 12th. There's a character who suffers from PTSD, and sort of when it strikes, he starts, he sort of can't breathe, and his leg starts hurting for no particular reason. He's suddenly limping along. So that's definitely something that I've never really thought of, but I do actually do that sort of thing. I put that into the page sometimes.
That's neat.
I had one of my characters, she walks around a lot, she's got a lot of grief to work out, and she says she just walks, she'll walk miles in a day, and she doesn't take the train, or because she'll just walk because she needs that time to to sort of process things and sort of reclaim the city that was taken from her. Long story.
I feel that deeply and physically when you say that, to walking to process grief. That's basically dealing with that daily. So well played. Okay, well, we have gotten a bunch of lovely messages thanking us for this, so I'll just read a couple of those before we wrap. Julie Goodfire Serene says, just seeing panels like this and seeing how common it is has helped me feel a lot better. So thank you so much for just talking about this openly. And for writing those characters. And Pam agrees, absolutely. And it's helpful for so many of us to share, write, and read these experiences. And yeah, I think that's about it. But I would like to thank you all personally for coming. I really appreciate it. This is a very personal panel on many levels, and I really appreciate the raw openness from everyone here. I also appreciate your time. And thank you for helping with QuorumCon in general. It is all thanks to panelists like you that we are able to run as a show, for all the work that the volunteers do. Without panelists, we got nothing. So thank you so much for being here. Really hugely appreciated. And to everyone else, the very next thing that we've got coming is a reading with, wait, let me check the schedule, Amanda Cherry. Amanda Cherry does great readings. You should really go listen to her read. She's a trained actor, and when she reads her own books, it's really fantastic. So please don't miss that. That is up at 6:15 Central. So coming right up. And after that, there's another reading by our own Pam Livingston, and then another reading by J.D. Brink. And the last panel of the day is at 8 p.m. with bloggers and reviewers. Don't miss that either. Also, please check out QuorumCon2021.com. Check out the schedule, check out our merch listings, check out Artist Alley, and check out all the great books from our authors and art from artists. Lots of great things to see there. Also, additional details about all of our lovely panelists. And you can also find them all on Twitter. They've been linked. Check out QuorumCon's list. We've been tweeting about them all day. So thank you, everyone. And I'm about to go push something with a P, the red button that will stop me embarrassing myself. And we're done.